It's day 6 of rain. Not a drizzle, a cold, gray, unbroken downpour that has turned your commute into a small war and your umbrella into a casualty. You're irritated. You're damp. You're one delayed bus away from a full meltdown. Now take away the bus. Take away the umbrella. Take away the apartment, the radiator, the dry socks in the drawer. Put yourself in a forest in prehistoric Europe, 60,000 years ago, in a rainy season that does not end for weeks. The air sits just above the temperature that can kill you, and every single thing you need to stay alive gets harder the wetter it gets. Here's the reframe. We love talking about the dramatic threats to early humans, the predators, the migrations, the wars. Rain gets none of that attention. It's unglamorous. It's slow. And it was, for most of human history, one of the most reliable killers our species ever faced. Not because it drowns you, because it makes you cold, quietly, for hours, until your body simply stops keeping up. Water pulls heat off your skin roughly 25 times faster than air does. That number is the whole story. You don't need snow to die of exposure. You need wet clothes, a light wind, and a temperature around 10 degrees Celsius. A normal British summer, an ordinary spring night in Central Europe, a completely unremarkable Tuesday in most of the places ancient humans actually lived. So before food, before shelter, before anything else, the first skill of a wet world was keeping your core temperature up. And ancient humans got frighteningly good at it. Start with fire, because fire and rain are natural enemies. Wet wood doesn't light. Wet tinder doesn't catch. And a fire that dies in a hypothermic situation isn't an inconvenience. It's the difference between morning and no morning. So early humans stopped treating fire as an event and started treating it as infrastructure. You didn't make fire when you needed it. You kept it alive, continuously, the way you keep your fridge running today without ever thinking about it. Groups carried embers wrapped in slow-burning moss, fungus, or specific bark, sometimes for hours of travel, sometimes across whole seasons. And this created something we can actually date. Hearths that burned for years, not relit but maintained, tended, protected. Evidence of one of the earliest divisions of labor archaeologists can point to. Somebody's entire job, in bad weather, was sitting with the fire. Here's where it gets interesting, because fire needs a roof to survive real rain, and the popular image of the caveman hiding in a cave is mostly wrong. Caves preserve evidence well, so caves get the headlines, but they're rare, often already occupied by something with teeth, and geographically useless if you're crossing open country. Most ancient humans built their shelter instead. At Terra Amata, on the French coast near Nice, excavations led by archaeologist Henry de Lumley uncovered constructed shelters dating back roughly 400,000 years. Branches angled and leaves layered like shingles, so rain ran off instead of through. Same principle as your roof. Worked out with no blueprint, by hominids with a noticeably smaller brain than yours. And it kept improving. At Mezhirich, in Ukraine, archaeologists found dwellings built from mammoth-bone dating to around 15,000 years ago. Heavy bones anchored into the ground against wind, hides stretched over the frame, insulation packed inside. This wasn't a hole to hide in. It was an engineered structure, built specifically to hold heat and keep water out. And that hide is worth pausing on, because turning a dead animal's skin into a waterproof coat is one of the more underrated inventions in human history. Scrape it, stretch it, treat it with fat, smoke it, and you've essentially made leather, flexible, insulating, far more water-resistant than woven plant fiber. Reindeer doing unpaid coat manufacturing labor for early Europeans. Genuinely respect. But it gets stranger, because the cognitive leap behind this is bigger than it sounds. You kill the animal today. You process the hide over several days. The finished coat protects you from weather that hasn't happened yet. That's planning across a gap of time, solving a problem that doesn't exist until it suddenly does. Archaeologist Lynn Wadley, whose research on prehistoric technology comes largely out of Sibudu Cave in South Africa, has argued that compound technologies like hide treatment and adhesive making required something close to modern multitasking cognition, holding several steps and future outcomes in your head at once. Rain, in other words, didn't just threaten ancient humans. It appears to have helped build the kind of brain that could outthink it. Now, the part almost nobody covers, landscape literacy. We've outsourced weather awareness to an app icon. Ancient humans couldn't. They read the smell of rain before it fell. That specific scent, petrichor, was formally identified and named in 1964 by Australian researchers Isabel Joy Baer and Richard Thomas. But people had been reading it, unnamed, for tens of thousands of years. They watched birds fly lower, insects swarm, cloud color shift, wind direction turn. This wasn't mysticism. Researcher Louis Liebenberg, who has spent decades documenting tracking skills among southern African hunter-gatherer communities, has shown that this kind of environmental reading is a learnable, teachable expertise. Not an instinct, a skill, sharpened the same way you'd sharpen any skill your life depended on. And it went down to the ground itself. Cold air sinks. Wet air pools in low spots. Camp on a slight rise and you wake up damp. Camp in a hollow and you wake up in a puddle. South-facing slopes dry faster. Dense canopy intercepts a real percentage of a storm before it even reaches you. None of this was random. Groups return to the same good sheltering spots for generations. You can see it in the archaeological layers, ash and bone and tools stacked on top of each other at the same location, decade after decade, because someone found a good spot once and told everyone after them. Let's reconstruct one evening. The sky's been shifting all afternoon. Lower clouds, birds flying wrong, a change in the wind that everyone in camp clocks without discussing it. There's still light, so instead of waiting for the first drop, the group moves. Someone starts angling branches against a slope that drains well. Someone else feeds the embers they've been carrying all day. By the time the rain actually starts, there's already a dry roof, a live fire, and a group of bodies pressed close together underneath it. Nobody got caught, nobody panicked. This was Tuesday. Here's the twist. Their bodies weren't just adapted, they were trained. Fall into cold water today, and your body panics. Sharp inhale, racing heart. A reflex called the cold shock response, studied extensively by physiologist Michael Tipton at the University of Portsmouth. But that response softens with repeated cold exposure. People regularly exposed to cold water or cold weather show a measurably reduced reaction over time. Ancient humans were wet and cold constantly. Their baseline wasn't toughness handed down by evolution alone. It was a body continuously recalibrated by an environment that never let up. Not superhuman, just well-practiced. And none of it worked alone. A body in a group loses heat slower than a body by itself. Sleeping arrangements were dense and pragmatic. Privacy is a warm-weather luxury nobody in a storm could afford. Firekeeping, foraging, decision-making about where to move. All of it split across the group by age and skill. Children kept at the warm center. The whole unit functioned less like a tribe and more like a single thermoregulation system, with several sets of hands. Now the heavier part. When an elder died in one of these groups, it wasn't only a loss of a person, it was a loss of institutional memory. Which tree bark burns slowly enough to carry an ember for 6 hours? Which slope drains before dawn? Which fungus fruits abundantly right after a storm and is safe to eat? That knowledge lived in specific people, and once it was gone, it didn't come back easily. Caring for elders who could no longer forage or build wasn't sentiment. It was the group protecting its own survival archive, a habit whose earliest traces in the archaeological record predate written language by an almost unfathomable stretch of time. The honest answer is, we don't know the exact moment any single one of these skills was invented, or by whom, or how many failed, fatal attempts came before the ones that worked. What we do know, from Terra Amata to Mezhirich to Sibudu, is the pattern. Humans facing a slow, unglamorous, relentless threat, and instead of just enduring it, engineering their way past it. One waterproofed hide and one carried ember at a time. You've been stuck inside for 3 days because of rain, irritated, scrolling, waiting for it to pass. Somewhere in your ancestry, a person spent an entire wet, freezing night solving exactly this problem, with nothing but attention, patience, and the stubborn refusal to just lie down and get rained on. Every dry roof you've ever stood under is downstream of that night. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. What's the modern version of the storm you're not preparing for? The slow, boring threat everyone underestimates because it doesn't have teeth. Tell me in the comments. And if this scratched the itch, there's a lot more where it came from.